Welcome to the Wellness Law Podcast, where wellness and the law meet for contemplation and collaboration. This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Health and Wellness Law. I am your host, Barbara Zabawa. Welcome to the Wellness Law Podcast, Mark Brezzell. Hi, everyone. I want you to meet Mark Brezzell. He is a former cardiovascular perfusionist by training, and he spent 20 or more years in medical affairs, but now has a thriving wellness business that focuses on the vascular impact of stress. And I thought this was a very important and relevant topic since we had just done a few podcasts recently on the Wellness Law Podcast on organizational culture, toxic bullying culture at work. And of course, one effect of that is stress on the employees who experience those kinds of cultures. And Mark is going to talk to us about the clinical issues and symptoms around that stress, and of course, the adverse impact it has on employee well-being. So welcome, Mark.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Let's dive right in. So you are now running this business that focuses on vascular impact of stress. Tell us why you started that business.
Okay, first of all, like you said, I'm just tracing my background. I spent 10 years in cardiac surgery as a cardiovascular perfusionist. I worked in Toledo, Ohio for many years doing that. And I saw firsthand the impact of not only stress, but just the disease progression in general. But as you start to look at their lifestyles and you start to recognize that this is the end result of just a great amount of pressure, of stress, that's the final presentation of everything. And after about 20-something years in industry, in fact, the last job I was at, we were developing interventional devices for vascular injury, particularly for arterial damage. I was working on a cerebral stent for cerebral reduction of cerebral disease, or I should say reduction of arterial disease going up into the brain, and also developing stents in the lower limbs, patients with peripheral arterial disease. So these are ways that they can open up the blood vessels and mitigate the ischemic damage in that area. So what I've decided when I look at this whole network of patients, I'm thinking to myself, why are these patients here? And majority of these patients were there because of lifestyle. Over 90% were there because of lifestyle and poor lifestyle decisions that they're making. And it kind of sat with me because I noticed that what I did was intervention, but what are we doing to prevent ourselves from being in that situation? We're really good at intervention. We're really good at helping to mitigate what the problem is now. But is there anything we can do to prevent it from getting to that point, or to prevent it from reoccurring? Because many times we also instruct patients that, hey, if you do have a heart attack, if you end up with a stroke, what are ways to mitigate this so it doesn't happen again? But I'm from the adage that this is a one and done type of deal. If you can keep all of your original equipment in tip-top shape, your longevity and quality of life will be much better. So I felt passionate about that. I'm a type 1 diabetic. I've been a diabetic now for 26 years. And all throughout surgery and all my years in industry, I had to mitigate this as well. And so I thought it was very important for me to break away and help people to understand that there are many things that we can do to prevent ourselves from being in a situation where we're either in a hospital bed or going through rehab or that sort of thing, because you really want it's a good thing that we have the technology, but if you can prevent that from happening, you're in a much, much better place.
Oh, that's such a great message. You've seen it firsthand. You've seen the extreme effects of long-term stress
Yes.
on the body from the actual inside.
From inside, yes, literally.
Yeah. And I love that you are talking about trying to prevent it in the first place. Yes. Kudos to all of the medical practitioners and people who intervene when a crisis occurs.
Yes.
Those are very high.
Critically important. Life savers.
Yes, high stakes jobs. I know I wouldn't be able to do it, but glad to have people who do that.
Yes.
At the same time, you're right. There are things that you can do so you never find yourself laying on an operating table
Yes.
and getting a stent in. And
Yes.
so I approach the law in a similar way. With law, you can find yourself in a courtroom. That's like the equivalent of an operating table
That's right. Exactly.
in legal world. And I'm glad that there are lawyers who can go into the courtroom and try to help you mitigate as much damage as possible.
Yeah.
But there are ways you can prevent yourself from ever getting inside of a courtroom. And I think that's where our two worlds intersect, because as we talk about employee well-being, that if you don't prevent employees from getting to the point where they are suffering physically and mentally from a toxic work culture, from a high stress environment, you're going to find yourself in a courtroom, and they're going to find themselves possibly on an operating table. So what can an employer, because you work a lot with corporate
Yes.
and law firms in particular,
Yes.
but any high stress kind of an industry, I finance, media, health and healthcare, all those types of industries could benefit from your counsel. So tell us, what are, I understand that you're giving a presentation for the American Bar Association in October
Yes.
for their lawyer assistance program, and your
Yes.
title for your talk is Thriving Under Pressure: 8 Principles of Sustainable Legal Performance. This is directed, of course, at the legal industry. But
That's right.
tell us what can be done both individually as well as in the company. Prevent yourselves from getting into the courtroom and onto the operating table.
It's interesting when we think about this thing. First of all, I tell people, and I tell lawyers in particular, no, actually everybody, but just because many times health is not an issue for us until health becomes an issue. And so many times we push because we feel that there's normalcy in that, but we don't think about the long-term implications of now allowing our bodies to take a break, now allowing our bodies to rest. And I think for me, I always start off with, think of a car. A car requires routine maintenance, specific types of gas, particularly if let's say if it's a high-end car, it requires premium gasoline. So I'm saying we have reached a point in this society where we take better care of our cars than we do our own health. And that's the challenge. And that's where I caveat here for I want people to step back and think, okay, how do you take care of your automobile? Or do you? And for those who have not taken care of their automobile, what has been the outcome? That's the same thing with us. And so for me, I try to help people understand that there is not a badge of honor push through, because pushing, there's levels. There's nothing wrong with obviously working hard. And that's what we're here to do, particularly in your profession. If you're actually advocating for individuals, it's necessary for you to put in the time and the work to make sure that you're prepared, you've done your research, you present good arguments. But the downside of that is that even you may win your case, but do you recognize what you're doing to your body? Because my thing is availability is the best productivity. If you're not available to stand in the gap for your clients, where does that lead you? Where does that lead them? So I try to help them understand you have to be available. Now, how am I going to be available? We have to take better care of ourselves. It's a very simple formula. It doesn't require you to be part of an expensive health club. It doesn't require any extensive changes in your lifestyle. Little changes can go a long ways. And again, you mentioned my title, 8 Key Principles for Sustainable Performance. Basically, do you get enough fresh air? Do you get enough sunshine? Do you get enough rest? How is your diet? Do you exercise? And these are the things that are critically important that we take for granted, because many times, usually when we're focused on a task, we don't integrate a lot of these things. Something is going by the wayside. So my encouragement is to take a step back, do an audit in your everyday life. How much time am I giving for rest? What am I eating in the process? Am I getting enough rest? Am I drinking water? What type of things am I consuming? Is everything as I'm running out the door something quick, something microwavable, or just a quick thing? And the problem with that is you're dealing with a lot of processed stuff and processed food, and as we eat all that stuff, that has a major negative impact in us because that's a great source of inflammation, which causes a lot of these problems that present in vascular disease.
So you've been mentioning a lot of things that the individual needs to be cognizant of, their diets, their ability to rest. Of course, you're talking about industries like the law and high stress industries where it's not just the person in necessarily having worked in legal law firms. I know that it's not just individual choices and
That's right.
individual ability to manage time that's at issue. It's external demands of the
That's right.
job and the way that the employer, the organization to which the employee is doing work is also subject to the culture and
That's right.
the leadership and expectations and environment, both physical and social environment. So when you're working with corporate clients, what are you doing to address those more organizational factors?
Again, from a corporate standpoint, we focus on availability, absenteeism. How healthy is your workforce? Are you more focused on being productive and the bottom line, not recognizing that the intricacies that are involved in that can dramatically impact your bottom line as your workforce as they start to burn out, as they start to run out of gas, and because of their lifestyle, as they start to take on more chronic conditions that occur, whether it's a heart attack or whether it's stroke. Usually, when you get to that point, your productivity has dramatically been reduced
Mm.
because many times it takes a minute for you to recuperate from some of these conditions, particularly depending on whether it's minimal, whether it's mild or moderate or even severe. And so I try to help them understand that you have to put in place a way for them to be able to take breaks, a way for them to be able to compensate for the high demand that you have in place. And that's critically important that you have to find ways to step back and allow them to exhale. Whether it's some places, whether you basically and emphasize and have water there available, making sure they stay very hydrated, have very good productive luncheons where you bring in really good food, healthy food, and even demand say, hey, look, take a break. You take a 10-minute break, walk around the building, leave your desk, leave your office, and just go move because that helps your mind to reset. If you just keep pushing, you keep pushing. Think about a machine.
Yeah.
If you're driving your car, you keep your car, you're driving 80 miles an hour, you keep revving that engine. You got to, it has to break from time to time.
So how receptive are the clients that you work with, the corporate clients that you work with, to these ideas that their employees, their most valuable asset, need
Right.
breaks, need an environment in which it's conducive to eating better and sleeping and taking rest when needed.
Yeah.
How
Well,
are they?
I think there's an evolution that's in process. Some are not as receptive. Some feel when you're in that mindset, I don't have time because our docket is full. We don't have the time to integrate some of these things. But then when you remind them, okay, if you don't make the time, then what's going to happen is your absenteeism is going to start to increase. Your productivity is going to start to decrease because if people aren't given a chance to, and there's numbers, and I don't have them in front of me, but there's numbers to really to show that the percentages, and that's what I tend to bring in there. I'll show them the numbers of companies that have integrated a more of a balanced kind of a workflow for their employees, which allows them to take some time to breathe, take some time to take the foot off the gas, to kind of to exhale There's ways you can still maintain a high level of accountability, a high level of productivity, but at the same time, when you start having people getting sick, and also if you think about, for example, diabetes, where that can a lot of these things can be contributors to that. Stress can open up the door to a lot of challenging problems, and when you don't see it, it's something that kind of increases over time. And I tell them all the time that when you start getting involved in rehab and being on medication, and they're going to start having taking, like I said, taking more time off because now they're sick. They try to work through sickness. Some people have worked through sickness and ended up in a very dire situation, i.e., death or debilitated or having to take leaves of absence. So if you provide these things up front, a lot of this negative stuff can be mitigated on the back.
So when you say provide these things, you mean built-in rest breaks, in healthy food options.
Even a discussion. See, here's the thing. One of the things that I offer is the ability to be able to go and say, okay, let's put this in neutral for a minute. Let's stand back. Because many times what I'm finding is that the biggest problem a lot of companies are dealing with is perspective. When I say perspective, we don't sometimes recognize what we're doing. When you're in we're in a mindset, a lot of times, a lot of stuff that normally, well, we would take advantage of, it just goes right over our head because our focus is not there. And what I tried to do is I tried to help the leadership to step back and say, okay, do you do you see any challenges with this? Is there any problem with no gaps, no rest period, no downtime? Do you see that as a problem? If they don't see it as a problem, then I try to help them understand where the problems can arise. And many times you begin to understand, well, I guess you probably could offer some places may say, okay, stay on Friday, or we're working remote from there, or just kind of integrating ways of being able to shift our focus a little bit and still maintain productivity.
Yeah. Do you ever talk to leaders about toxic work culture, like a bullying atmosphere or where employees feel not only overworked from the demands of the job, but they have interactions with other employees, maybe supervisors or others in with authority are feeling bullied by them. And of course, that is going to contribute to stress.
That's a huge contributor to stress because now it's a double-edged sword. You have trouble focusing on your day job because now you're in this protective mindset. So you're not, it splits your focus, which reduces your productivity. And also at this higher level of stress, it's affecting you mentally and affecting you physically. See, it starts here, but it doesn't stay there. That's what I try to help them understand, that if they're mentally stressed, physically manifesting all that, and that will break the whole system down. And now you start to see a higher level of people calling on, getting sick. They're going to the doctors more often. And those who don't go with their doctors, they may wait to a point where, or they get to a point where their bodies will tell them, okay, time out. And they're now forced to go to the doctors. So I try to help them understand, for them personally, think of, do you have headaches? I exuberantly tired that you work yourselves through. That's your body's signals telling you something is not right. Need a break. I need you to take the foot off the gas. And when we blow past all that, then your body eventually down the road becomes weakened. And now you open up the door for a lot of critical, acute type of interventions or things that are necessary for acute intervention. And you don't want that.
So how long what is the average length of time between the initial onset of a stressful environment or work and these more acute physical manifestations of stress? Is it obvious it's going to be different for everybody?
It's going to be different. Yeah, that varies.
But an average, are we talking months, years? What is the
Usually it's years.
years?
It's not something that happens and that's the problem, is that it's not something that manifests itself very immediately. In an acute setting, it just doesn't manifest. So it's just something that takes, that's why a lot of these conditions are called the silent diseases or silent presentations. People who may be dealing with colorectal cancer is something that can be manifesting itself for years. You never even notice because you don't have symptoms. Same thing with stress. A lot of times, I would say, for me, I found that the biggest time frame where things start to manifest themselves from high stress for people who have been during stress is between 50 and 70.
Age? Are you talking about
Yes.
people?
Usually 50 and 60 are usually the critical. That's usually the age of manifestations of long-term abuse of your system via stress or
Mm,
whatever, whether it's artificially induced, if you're heavily like a smoker or heavy a drinker. And when you do excesses, usually in your 50s and 60s is when you start really seeing this stuff manifest.
inter-
And unfortunately, this day and age, they're starting so much younger, so that number is actually dropping down to the 40s. But people are presenting with, I remember when I was still in practice, we would see patients coming in at 40s and the 50s with multivessel disease. And now that's because of our diet on top of our stressful environment. That's kind of, they're trying to pull down the numbers for pretty much all of these chronic diseases. They're presenting much sooner. So, yes, 40s and 50s and definitely into the 60s. Those are the areas where that's the age of, I call it accountability. If you weren't doing what you should have been doing, body will begin to tell you you weren't doing what you should have been doing.
So here's a cynical question for you. Since a manifestation of prolonged stress starts to show up in close to retirement age.
Not necessarily, I won't say close to retirement. I would say mid range to retirement.
Yeah.
Because think of how many people who've actually pushed their way through to retirement.
Yeah. But you said 50s and 60s
Mhm.
typical are the typical
That's average, yes. Yeah.
age when, if we're talking about employees, they might start seeing the physical effects of prolonged
Mhm.
stress, whether it's through lifestyle choices or a toxic work environment or both, or outside of the work environment, socioeconomic factors. So the cynical question is, if you're working with employers and you're telling them, look, your employees who are in their 50s and 60s are more likely to start showing the effects of prolonged stress, they're the ones who are going to start needing the medical attention, the interventions that can be very costly to you. Would the employer care if would they
Well,
and those are older employees anyway, so we can just get rid of them and start
but
with
you have, but keep in mind, that's an average. Whenever you have averages, you always have outliers. So
yeah,
you have those that in the 30s and the 40s manifest themselves. In fact, they're finding now that, particularly in coronary artery disease, that numbers are being reduced because of not only just stress, also just diet. A lot of highly processed foods is a big contributor to inflammation. Inflammation is a big contributor to the formation of a lot of these lesions that present themselves in patients. So even in young people, you can begin seeing that manifestation. Some people moderate their activity. Some may get more active. Others. So yes, it can happen. It can happen in the 40s. It can happen younger. When I
yeah,
say average, normally the averages are actually shifting. See, we're getting sicker, unfortunately. So a lot of times that retirement age of accountability is starting to shift a little bit because we're seeing presentation younger and younger because some people have access to, they're getting on vaping and they're doing all of these things at a younger age and longer period of time. They're getting really smarter about it. Instead of you walking around smoking a cigarette, and now you're vaping, that's something you can do and people don't even know you do it. Not it's out in front of your face and they're able to do all these risky behaviors behind the scenes or undercover. And so these things are presenting themselves. But for the typical worker, I mean, you're coming in your late 20s and your 30s and you're working hard. Yes, usually by the time you can keep pushing through. But if you want to rotate, if you want to just have a company of 20-year-olds here,
yeah.
that's what that's one way of manifesting some level of productivity. But then you're going to start losing experience.
That's right. That's right. And legally, you don't want to be discriminating against your older American.
Yes,
Age Discrimination and Employment Act being one of
that's right.
This has been quite educational. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack.
Yes.
I don't have time to do it, but I wanted to give the listeners a flavor for the kind of work that you do and that you're focusing in on law firms and other high stress industries, which of course have the increased likelihood of having bullies and toxic workplace culture that further contribute and exacerbate the impact of stress.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad that you are out there to help guide these organizations toward a more balanced, employee friendly environment and
Absolutely.
hoping that more of these companies reach out to you to get that kind of guidance. So if someone wanted to learn more about what you do, how could they find out more?
Like, you reach out to my website, www.mdblive.com. That's my website, and all my information is on there, including ways of reaching me. I do have social media, but that's all inclusive. Everything about me can be taken right off my website.
Great. I'll make sure I put that in the comments. And yeah, and I assume people can also learn about you on LinkedIn. And you said social
Yes.
media on
LinkedIn, Instagram. I put educational posts on there. But before I leave, I just want people to understand that stress is no longer considered a state of mind. It's also a physiological condition. It's a fun. So when people understand that if you undergoing a great deal of stress, whether, like you said, it's toxicity on the job or just working past limits that you put on yourself, your body is in. And I tell people, I think when we had our initial discussion, I tell you, if you're starting to age on the outside, your body, is catching up. Your body is already aging on the inside. You just see a difference. And so a lot of times when you ask that point, even though I give you a kind of a generic type of a time frame, the fact of the matter is things are happening much sooner than it's manifested. And so that's why I say, don't wait until that. These averages are just projections. Everybody's different.
Yeah.
It all depends on what other comorbidities may exist that you aren't even aware of. So
Yeah.
if you can, I just want people to understand that stress is real, stress is physiologic, and stress in and of itself is very toxic to your system.
I think that's an important point to end on. And I appreciate you so much, Mark. So thank you for being on the program.
Yes, thank you, Heaven. Appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to the Wellness Law Podcast. You can find more wellness law resources by visiting the Center for Health and Wellness Law website at www.wellnesslaw.com, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Until the next episode, stay well, stay hopeful, and stay legal.